بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام الأتمان الأكملان على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين أما بعد. We'll continue on from where we left off, which was from Masail al-Mubah, from the issues that relate to permissibility in Al-Usul. And so I'm just going to repeat the last portion that we never really got to explain properly before we move on to the next issue بإذن الله تبارك وتعالى, which is إطلاقات المباح والتعريف الآخر المباح, and then إطلاقات المباح. And so here the Sheikh رحمه الله تعالى, he says وخرج بقولنا لذاته, that what is excluded from our definition, the definition that he chose رحمه الله تعالى, which was ما لا يتعلق به أمر ولا نهي لذاته, that the mubah, that which is permissible, is that which no command and no prohibition is attached to. And we spoke about this time and time again, this phraseology of the Sheikh rahimahullah ta'ala. And so he says ما لو تعلق به أمر لكونه وسيلة لمأمور به. So the reason why he adds on لذاته here is because he's speaking to us about two types of rulings. There are a type of rulings that concern the very objective of things themselves, meaning the ruling that Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, when he addressed his slaves, the ruling that he attached a certain thing to. And then there is the ruling that that thing can be associated with because it becomes a means to something else. And so he says that the mubah that he is talking about here is al-mubahu li dhatih, that which is permissible intrinsically and by default. And that is by way of the lack of a command and a lack of prohibition, as the Shaykh rahimahullah ta'ala says. And so he says that this excludes acts that become, meaning in essence they're mubah, right? In essence that they're mubah, but then they become something that we are commanded with. Why? Because they become a means to something that is wajib or mandoob. And we mentioned a good example where we said to leave your house, right, to do whatever you want, is mubah in essence. But then you leaving your house to come to the masjid to pray becomes what? Becomes wajib, because you praying in Salat al-Jama'ah is wajib. And so here the author, rahimahullah, when he says لِذَاتِهِ, meaning intrinsically, he's saying that we're trying to exclude al-wasa'il. We're trying to exclude the rulings that become associated with the means, and we're only talking about the very objectives of those things. He says, in contrast to that, he says, أَوْ نَهْيٌ لِكَوْنِهِ وَسِيلَةٌ لِمَنْهِيٍّ عَنْ. And similarly, that this mubah takes the ruling of something that is prohibited or disliked because it becomes a means to that thing that is prohibited or disliked. And a good example would be the ruling of somebody leaving his house to go to a pub, for example. You say to him that him exiting his house as well, that journey that he makes towards that place for the sake of that haram is also haram, because that becomes a means to that which is haram. But here he's trying to say that all of this is excluded in our discussion and in our definition of al-mubah. Why? Because we're talking about al-mubahu li dhatihi, that which is intrinsically permissible based upon the address of the lawgiver, which is Allahu Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so then he moves on and he says, فَإِنَّ لَهُ حُكْمَ مَا كَانَ وَسِيلَةً لَهُ. Because these things, they take the ruling of what it is a means to. And here, wallahi, subhanallah, there's actually a very beautiful benefit. And does anybody know the Machiavellian principle? What is the Machiavellian principle? He had a load of principles, but there's one that concerns us here more specifically. أحسنت بالعربي الغاية تبرر الوسيلة. Okay, that the outcomes, right, they justify the means. And there's a lot of ways of separating between this Islamic principle and this Machiavellian principle. But one of them is here, subhanallah. Because the Machiavellian principle, it means that whatever you're doing, right, whatever action that you wish to do, the outcome that you're seeking, whatever means you want to take for it is justified. Here the author rahimahullah explains and he says that no, when it comes to the Sharia, al-wasa'il laha ahkam al-maqasid, it only becomes justified in one scenario only. When the ruling of the means is not defined, meaning a ruling was not attached. If that particular means is something that the Sharia prohibits, then it becomes a faulty way of seeking the outcome. And with that we differentiate between these two principles, the shaitani one and the divine one that comes to us from Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. And so he says, فَإِنَّ لَهُ حُكْمَ مَا كَانَ وَسِيلَةً لَهُ مِن مَأْمُورٍ. It takes the ruling of whatever you was a means to from that which we are commanded with. أَوْ مَنْهِيٍّ, or that which we are prohibited from engaging in. وَلَا يُخْرِجُهُ ذَلِكَ عَنْ كَوْنِهِ مُبَاحًا فِي الْأَصْلِ. None of those things lead for it to become or change its default position. Because as we know, means depend. Means are what you'd call a variable. They're not ahkamun thabita. Al-ghayat are ahkamun thabita, meaning the objectives of things, right? Prayer itself, for example. Prayer itself is never going to change. That obligation remains an obligation upon every single Muslim in all places and times, except where there are preventative measures. The preventative reasons that prevent you from, for example, praying, or for example, a Muslim sister, her menstruation or things like that, right? That prevent her from praying. But the essence of the ruling is what? That prayer remains the same. But these wasa'il, they are variable, right? You call them ahkamun marina in maqasid, meaning that they change depending on the circumstance. And so, for example, exiting your house and going somewhere will vary. Is he going to the masjid? Is he going there? Is he going here? Right? All of those different rulings become attached based upon the outcome. And so here he explains that none of that will oppose the default position of these type of rulings. And so he says, وَلَا يُخْرِجُهُ ذَلِكَ عَنْ كَوْنِهِ مُبَاحًا فِي الْأَصْلِ. That none of these rulings change its very essence, that it remains permissible as a default position of these type of rulings, which are the wasa'il. And like I said to you, with that you learn the differentiation between what? Machiavelli and the Sharia of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. For example, right now, if you were to say somebody, or somebody was to say to you, can I rob so that I can build a masjid? You say to them, no. But somebody else says to you, oh, can I do this means and that means to fundraise, to try and build a house for Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala? You'd say yes. Because one of them, the means was unspecified. And that is what we're talking about here. An unspecified means that is in origin mubah, that is permissible. That is what becomes a wasila. That is what becomes a means whereby we attach other rulings to it depending on the objective. As for that which is known by Shari'at al-Islam to be muharram, it can't become a means to something that we are commanded with. Okay? Now. The end justify the means. So for him, it's the fact that whatever you want, the end goal that you seek, right? Whatever means that you wish to take, becomes a justification. The means that you take, whether it's permissible, impermissible, whatever the scenario is justified by the outcome that you seek, right? But in the Sharia, that's not the case. The outcomes and the objectives do not justify the means. The means have to remain permissible, and its rulings will shift and adapt slightly to match what it becomes a means for, right? But here, that's why he explains and he says, this last clause to do with wasa'il, that's why it's very important. And he's explaining that very concept, which is, فَإِنَّ لَهُ حُكْمَ مَكَانَ وَسِيلَةً لَهُ. That this type of mubah, that which is permissible in essence, and the default position is that it's permissible, it takes the ruling of what it becomes a means to, right? Whether it's ma'mur or manhiyun an, right? Whether we're commanded with it, which we said is wajib and mandub, manhiyun an, makruh and muharram, وَلَا يُخْرِجُهُ ذَلِكَ عَنْ كَوْنِهِ مُبَاحًا فِي الْأَصْلِ. None of that changes and shifts the very fact that it still remains permissible in essence. Now, no, for Islam, the end goal determines the means. So right now, for example, the prayer, is what led to us saying that you leaving your house to come to the prayer becomes wajib as well, right? So it's the reason why you're doing this particular means, the ruling, you just take it from that scenario and you attach it onto the means to it. And we'll talk about this in more detail, as we said, in the whole qa'idah that will come bi'idhnillahi tabaraka ta'ala, which is ma la yatimmu al-wajibu illa bihi, often referred to as muqaddimatul wajib. Muqaddimatul wajib. Muqaddimatul wajib is like the preface, or like it's almost like, you know how you have in mantiq, in logic, it's called when you're setting up an argument, right? You've got a first presumption and a second presumption, and sometimes even more than that. And then you have an outcome that you build based upon those two principles that you're putting together. Okay? So muqaddimatul wajib is almost like the fact that we are connecting it to another obligation. That obligation becomes almost like a prelude to it. And the ruling we just simply take from there. And so we say this is obligatory. This scenario is a means to that. And as a result of that, this has to be obligatory as well. So it's commonly referred to amongst the scholars of Usul as muqaddimatul wajib. The next issue after that is the other definition of how we define these ahkam as went by. And we define them based upon outcomes and their consequences. And so he says here, وَالْمُبَاحُ مَا دَامَ عَلَى وَصْفِ الْإِبَاحَةِ. Because we explained already that the mubah does shift somewhat. The mubah does shift somewhat, and it becomes a means to other things. But as long as it remains upon its default position, that's what the author rahmatullah is trying to say here. So this additional clause that he adds on, which never seen before, مَا دَامَ عَلَى وَصْفِ الْإِبَاحَةِ, as long as it remains in its very essence, or the original form of it still being permissible. Meaning what? That we're not looking at it from the lens of it becoming a means to something else. We're simply looking at it individually and independently of anything else. So he says it can also be defined to be فَإِنَّهُ لَا يَتَرَتَّبُ عَلَيْهِ ثَوَابٌ وَلَا عِقَابٌ. Then it is that which there is no reward or punishment associated with it. لَا يَتَرَتَّبُ, that there is no reward associated that comes off the back of it. So you doing it, you're not rewarded for. You leaving off, you're not punished for. And vice versa as well. You doing it, you're not punished for. You leaving off, you're not rewarded for. Okay, so there's no reward, no punishment completely associated with the ibaha as long as it remains in its default position. The last issue is what we also came to know as asma'uhu. Asma'uhu, which is the different names of al-mubah, or sometimes you can refer to it as itlaqat. Itlaqat, which is the different usages of this term. And so he says halal, halalan. So halal is, what is halal is also what is mubah. And similarly al-jaiz, al-jaiz, which is also that which is permissible. Before I move on from this point, however, I quickly want to cover something really important with regards to this topic of itlaqat al-mubah. Itlaqat al-mubah. Itlaqat al-mubah is of two types. Sometimes mubah, according to the scholars of usul and the scholars of fiqh as well, is used in what we discussed essentially, which is al-mubah al-asli, the original mubah. The original mubah is when you go back to that, you remember what I said about the spectrum of these legal rulings. So you say wajib, mandub, mubah, makruh, muharram. So this mubah al-asli is considered to be what? One of the five. One of the five. And so it's when you say one, or the mubah that differs to all five other rulings, right? That is the original usage of al-mubah. You have a second type of mubah which the author rahimahullah ta'ala is slightly pointing to and alluding to here by bringing in this conversation of al-halal wal-jaiz. Al-halal wal-jaiz, and also this other usage of the term mubah, is a different type of mubah, which is al-mubah that is not in its original form, which is kullu ma yuqabilu al-haram. everything that you say is not prohibited in the Sharia. So muharram being the furthest of, right, the other side of the spectrum, right? So in this scenario, you would say the wajib, the mandub, the wajib, the mandub, the mubah, the makruh. All of them are included in this other usage of how mubah is used. Okay? What do they all share? What do they all share? Al-arba'a. Al-wajib, al-mandub, al-makruh, wal-mubah. No, there's without a talab. Makruh, there's no talab. Makruh, there's a nahi. Reward. Not really, the opposite of it. I gave you a hint. All of that, كلها صحيح. But what is there in the muharram that you don't get with the rest of this? Sins. So basically, this halal, the meaning of it becomes that which if you were to do, you would not be sinful, and as a result of it, liable to punishment as a result. And as a result of that commonality in the rest of this, right, that commonality, it was referred to as the second definition of mubah, or the second usage of the term mubah. And that is the more common way of using halal. And that is why you see in the Quran what? Right? وَلَا تَصِفُ أَلْسِنَتُكُمُ الْكَذِبِ هَذَا حَلَالٌ وَهَذَا حَرَامٌ. Halal يقابل ماذا? Al-haram. So halal in this scenario is not synonymous to our mubah, which is the one we covered. And that is the point I'm trying to get to here, which is when he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَيُسَمَّى حَلَالًا وَجَائِزًا, he's shifted on, he wants to be aware of another usage of a mubah and to connect it to that. So it's not the mubah that he's gone on to describe in the previous lines. The mubah that he's gone into now, and similarly al-ja'iz, right? Al-ja'iz is not the mubah he's talking about previously. It's a whole different mubah, which is al-mubah alladhi huwa naqidul muharram. The mubah that is considered to be the opposite of what is haram. So basically the wajib, if you were to do what is wajib, are you sinful? Rather you're rewarded, right? If you were to do that which is recommended, are you sinful? You're rewarded also, right? If you were to do that which is mubah, are you punished? There's no reward or sin, right? If you were to do that which is makruh, are you punished? Similarly, you're not. Okay? It's disliked for you to do, but there's no punishment associated with it. That commonality is what this second definition of mubah deals with, and that is how halal is used, and similarly al-ja'iz. Let me just quote some scholars, inshallah ta'ala, for this point so you understand it properly. Ibn al-Najjar, rahimahullah ta'ala, says in Sharh Kawkab al-Munir, وَيُطْلَقُ الْمُبَاحُ وَالْحَلَالُ عَلَى غَيْرِ الْحَرَامِ. That the usage of the term mubah, and there's two usages, jot that down, very important. You've got the mubah, which is, you can almost consider it to be al-mubah al-mufassal, the detailed one, which you're going into the two axes of these rulings that we described from the beginning of these sessions, right? The two axes, talab and the nahi, okay? But this scenario, you only look at it from one framework, which is from you doing it, what are the consequences of it? You're not looking at it from the lens of if you to leave it off. Because a wajib, if you were to leave it off, you'd be sinful. Does that make sense? But we're only talking about it from min hayth al-fi'l, from the aspect of doing it. And so he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَيُطْلَقُ الْمُبَاحُ وَالْحَلَالُ عَلَى غَيْرِ الْحَرَامِ. That mubah and halal is used in another way for everything. Remember the five we spoke about, Zayn? Everything that is not haram is also referred to as permissible and halal. Okay? So the opposite of haram. The opposite of haram. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, and he concludes and he says, فَيَعُمُّ. And so it generalizes. And what is included under that generality is al-wajibu, wal-mandubu, wal-makruhu, wal-mubah. وَلَكِنَّ الْمُبَاحَ يُطْلَقُ عَلَى الثَّلَاثِ وَالْحَلَالُ عَلى الْأَرْبَعِ. And so he says here that the mubah is used for three of them and not four. Not for four. Which one exits? wajib. Why? Ahsant. But what is the key word we're looking for? You understood, firstly, the concept of halal and mubah in this context, right? But he says the more common usage of mubah in this scenario is that it doesn't include 4 of the 5, it includes 3 of the 5. So we said 3 of the 5 excluding the wajib, okay? You say mubah. Halal, we mean all 4, right? Wajib, mandub, makruh, mubah, except for the haram. But why has he excluded the wajib from the term mubah? So we explained halal. Halal is naqid al-muharram, right? The opposite of what is haram. What is mubah in this scenario? What does ibaha mean? Remember that definition we kind of said it's a little bit problematic. Ignore for now. Look deeper. What is the most distinctive quality of mubah? Takhyir, an option. The fact that you have that option, right? Do you have the option to do or not to do for the wajib? No. So that is why some scholars remove wajib from the specific usages or certain usages of al-mubah. Does that make sense? Takhyir. Wajib ma fi khiyar. There is no option. It's talib al-zami, right? There's no option. So what do the other 3 have in common? The takhyir, there's a level of, right? You're making a choice. Something that's better for you, something may be more harmful to you, but there's a choice there. Wajib, muharram, there are no choices. Then he continues and he says, but there's another usage of that as well, which is فَيُقَالُ لِلْوَاجِبُ وَالْمَنْدُوبُ وَالْمَكْرُوهُ مُبَاحٌ كَذَلِكَ. Some scholars even include the wajib. And that is because of what we spoke about, which is لِكَوْنِهِ نَقِيضُ الْمُحَرَّمِ, the opposite of what is haram. And all of that is from the usages of al-mubah. Now we're going to move on to, inshallah ta'ala, the next topic, bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala. And this is a complete shift in ahkam. Remember we said earlier, the ahkam, we can split them in 2 scenarios, okay? You've got ahkam that are what? Taklifiyya. What did we say? It was a rough sort of definition of that. Prescriptive. We're talking about something, we're giving it a ruling. So this, before it's happened, what is the ruling of doing this, okay? Ahkam wad'iyya. What is wada'? What do we call it? Declarative, okay? So you're declaring something after it's occurred, okay? But we're going to look at it from other lenses as well, inshallah ta'ala. Do you want to read for us, Akhi? واصل يا
الصحيح لغة السليم من المرض.
أحسن.
واصطلاحا
ما تترتب
آثار فعله عليه عبادة كان أم عقدا. الصحيح من العبادات ما برئت به الذمة وسقط به الطلب. الصحيح من العقود ما ترتبت آثاره على وجوده كالترتب الملك على عقد البيع مثلا. ولا يكون الشيء صحيحا إلا بتهام شروطه وانتفاء موانعه. مثال ذلك في العبادات أن يأتي بالصلاة في وقتها تامة شروطها وأركانها وواجباتها.
ومثال ذلك
في العقود أن يعقد بيعا تامة شروطه المعروفة مع انتفاء موانعه.
مثال
مثال فقد الشرط في العبادة أن يصلي بلا طهارة، ومثال فقد الشرط في العقد أن يبيع ما لا يملكه، ومثال وجود المانع في العبادة أن يتوضأ بنفل مطلق في وقت النهي، ومثال وجود المانع في العقد أن يبيع من تلزمه الجمعة شيئا بعد ندائها ثاني على وجه لا يباح.
So we'll stop here inshallah with al-fasid, okay? So we're going to go back to the beginning bi'idhnillah, which is Al-Ahkam Al-Wad'iyya. Al-Ahkam Al-Wad'iyya. Al-Ahkam Al-Wad'iyya, the author rahimahullah ta'ala doesn't really go into the very essence of what al-wad' comes from, alright? But al-wad' here is in reference to al-wad'iyya comes from al-wad', which is something that Allah tabarak ta'ala placed, or the placing of something. Al-wad'u huwa, the placing of something in essence. And here we're talking about wad'u al-shari', that the lawgiver placed something with regards to these specific scenarios. Here, what was placed is, what we're talking about is declarative now, okay? So what was placed regarding those rulings that went by is that Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, for those rulings to bear their consequences, right? That we spoke about of reward and sin and so on, He placed certain things so we judge the accuracy of what we've done. And that includes things like asbab, right? Asbab being, like for example, sababu al-wujub, the reason why something became obligatory. Let's just stick to things that we're all familiar with, okay? Prayers, for example. When does a prayer becomes obligatory upon you? When do prayers become obligatory upon us? Shurut. There is going to be an overlap, ahsant, but it's more specific than shurut. Naam. Bulugh would be a good one. So generally speaking, for the human sort of lifetime, your lifetime, the obligation of prayer started when you reached the age of puberty. Okay? But more specifically now, say for example, if I was to say, هل وجبت علي صلاة المغرب اليوم? Has the Maghrib prayer of today become obligatory upon me yet? The answer would be no. All right? So the reason for that prayer to become obligatory upon me has yet to occur. Why? Dukhul al-waqt, the entry of the time. So when that prayer time comes in, the prayer becomes what? Obligatory upon me. Do you understand? That's the first scenario. So the Sharia places remember we spoke about every ruling, we said it has consequences. Reward, sin. For those rewards and sins to become factual, number one, it places a sabab, a reason for those obligations to occur. Okay? Sabab. It also places shurut, conditions, for the validity of those worship. It places mawani', times where those acts of worship do not become obligatory upon you, but become obligatory upon those around you, for example. Right? And those have scenarios. And so based upon the presence of these three, asbab, shurut, mawani', that the Sharia placed surrounding all of those actions that a human being may be engaged in, right? Its wujud, its presence, we can either confirm or negate the following, which is as-sihhatu al-fasad, the validity or the invalidity of that worship. And so if those three or two of them are met and one of them is negated, so if the condition or the reason for the act of worship to become obligatory upon you is there, and the conditions that Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, right, made as a criteria for you to fulfill before the act of worship are met, and you have no preventative issues, then that prayer becomes valid. And the consequences that we described previously are there, such as reward and a lack of sin. If there is an issue with one of these three. You prayed before its time. You prayed without wudu. A woman's prayed whilst she's menstruating. We say what? That prayer is invalid. And those consequences, right, that we spoke about of what happens if you miss an obligation may come about. Does that make sense? Not all the time, but may come about. So what is al-wada'? How would you summarize and describe the concept of al-wada'? I think quite simply just put down that these are things that Sharia has laid down, right? That is what the wada' literally means. Wada' is to place something, to lay something here, right? Wada'a shay, wada'tu, a shay, meaning I put this down, I laid it down, okay? Things that the Sharia has laid down, and the meaning of that is legislated, right? Wada' here is shara'at. And these pertain to certain matters, such as causes, criteria and conditions, shurut, and preventatives. And by its presence, we establish or negate something. And by its absence, we establish or negate things as well. And so we're going to see examples of all of this bi'idhnillahi tabarak ta'ala scattered across. The Sheikh rahimahullah ta'ala, he has a lot of examples, but these examples are limited to as-salah or bay'ah. So he varies between what is considered to be from that realm of what concerns the slave and his creator, and that realm of that which concerns the slave and the rest of the creation of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. Let's go back to it now. The definition that the Sheikh rahimahullah ta'ala gives here is Al-Ahkam al-Wad'iyya are. So remember we said it's a type of Ahkam shar'iyya, a type of Islamic rulings. We call it declarative rulings, meaning post actions, okay? As we'll see for the most part. Its the most common usage is after you do something. And you're trying to determine the validity of it and whether you need to redo it or not. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, هو ما وضعه الشارع من أمارات لثبوت أو انتفاء أو نفوذ أو إلغاء. It is things that the lawgiver has placed and laid down, right? As amarat, which are signs. Amarat are alamat. As signs, okay? Signs. These signs, they indicate something to us. So it says lithubuti, that indicate thubut, the affirmation of that thing. Aw intifa, or its negation. Aw nufudhin, or its validity. Aw ilgha'in, or its invalidity and its nullification. We see examples of all of that. The author rahimahullah ta'ala doesn't really go into all of these different types of al-ahkam al-wad'iyya, but he simply just covers two of them. And he says, as-sihhatu wal-fasad. The two we're going to explore are just validity and invalidity. So when you say something, هذا صحيح, وهذا فاسد, that this is valid and this is invalid, what does that mean? That's the only thing. As for shurut, asbab, right, all these other types of ahkam al-wad'iyya, we're not going to go into with regards to this book, but it's covered more extensively in the bigger books of usul. Why? Why choose these two? Right? He chose these two, rahimahullah ta'ala, because these two are the ultimate goal and objective of the discussion of al-ahkam al-wad'iyya. So knowing the sabab of the hukum, knowing the shart, knowing the mani', right? knowing the cause and the conditions and the preventatives of a ruling, what does the knowledge of that benefit us? It helps us reach this ultimate goal of knowing what? Right? What is valid and invalid. And so it's as if he's saying that the ultimate goal of, there is stages, right, of how we determine validity and invalidity. And all of that is discussed in Ahkam Al-Wad'iyyah. But the objective of the study of Ahkam Al-Wad'iyyah is this: Sahihun wa Fasad. Whether to know that prayer that you prayed, was it valid, was it invalid? And so he says, look, the rest of that discussion, and there are many types of Ahkam Al-Wad'iyyah. Ada, Qada, I'ada, right? Illa, Hikmah, all of these different things are included in Ahkam Al-Wad'iyyah. He says, none of that I'm going to touch. This is a book for beginners. We're going to focus on one thing and one thing only, which is the objective and why we want to study Ahkam Al-Wad'iyyah to begin with. He starts us off with the first definition as usual. So he says, Rahimahullah Ta'ala, فَالصَّحِيحُ لُغَةً. That what is something that is valid, validity, as-sihha, what is it linguistically? He says linguistically it's to be as-salim, to be free of, right? Free of min al-marad, from sicknesses and ailments and defects, right? And so as-sihha is whenever you're free from any form of deficiency. When there's nothing that diminishes that thing or that person or anything like that. And so sihha fil insan, the sihha with regards to the human being, is that he is healthy and fit. And there's nothing health-wise that is sort of like lagging him or pulling him down. And then apply that to the other forms of as-sihha that you will come across. الصحيح لغة السليم, that is quite literally ما صار عليه أهل اللغة. And to be honest, a majority of Ahl al-Lugha might add on one or other clause, but the Sheikh Rahmatullah just removed it because it just complicates the definition. And so take for example Ibn Manzur, Lisan al-Arab, right? He just adds on as-salimu min al-uyub wal-amrad. So instead of it just being sicknesses, but uyub as well, which are defects. So people, for example, with disabilities and things like that, they learn to live with it. But it doesn't mean that they're fully considered healthy and fit. Animals, right? The Prophet ﷺ told us to look for the sahih from the animals to slaughter an udhiyah. Right? Animals that have defects. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said regarding that, la tujzi. It doesn't suffice, it's not valid, right? Al-arja al-bayyinu arajuha. The animal that limps. So you want to slaughter a camel, you want to slaughter a cow, you want to slaughter a sheep, and it's got urj in its leg, right? It's limping, it's got an issue with one of its legs. Don't slaughter it. You should slaughter a sahih. You should slaughter one that's free from any defects. The Prophet ﷺ went on to the eyes. Al-awra al-bayyinu awaruha. One that's got issue with one of its two eyes, or both even. Right? Only sees things from one eye, or he sees things from, or he doesn't see things at all, it's blind. Don't slaughter it. Slaughter the sahih. And that has some wisdom associated with regards to the udhiyah. But the point here is, those physical defects that the individual becomes, used to living with, or the animal is just attributed with, they're also considered munafi al-sihha wal-salama. They also oppose that, health and fitness and the normality of the circumstance of the animal. So don't slaughter something that is abnormal. And so sihha is anything that opposes that health and that normality. Ibn Manzur rahimahullah ta'ala says, as-suhhu was-sihhatu was-sihahu khilafu as-suqmi. Khilafu as-suqmi is the opposite of that illness. وَذَهَابُ الْمَرَضِ, and the absence and the disappearance of that illness or the ailment. وَقَدْ صَحَّ فُلَانٌ مِنْ عِلَّتِهِ, and that individual, he got healthy and he got better from that sickness that he was going through. He says صَحَّ وَاسْتَصْحَ وَاسْتَصْحَى, and he got better. Right? He got better, or he sought to treat himself. The ist comes with talab as well. And so that is the definition of as-sahihu fil lugha. The Sheikh rahimahullah ta'ala only took one aspect of that definition, which is as-salimu min al-marad. Is that the case, by the way? I'm using my own, so I put does he mention uyub? No, so if you wanted to add on another layer to it, is that al-amrad sometimes can be, for example, right now, you would say, generally speaking, that the marad can sometimes be internal, right? For example, somebody's got a virus, a bacteria, things like that. That comes under general marad. Whereas uyub are not so apparent. Uyub are the apparent things, right? Somebody's got a limp, somebody, is lacking an arm, these sort of things. That also is included in the opposite of as-sihha was-salama. As-sihhatu was-salama. تفضل.
في شرحه ذكر الشرط والمانع والسبب في شرحه وأشار إليها.
ما وصل إلى هذا، احنا في التعريف اللغوي، لكن سنأتي عليه فيما بعد بإذن الله. The next definition is واصطلاحا, which is how this terminology is used by the scholars of Islam, or more particularly this group of the scholars of Islam, which are the scholars of Al-Usul. How did they use the term as-sihha? So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, ما ترتبت آثار فعله عليه. ما ترتبت, right? That which the effects and the consequences and the outcomes of its legal ruling, right? And doing it come about. So for example, when you did the wajib, you were seeking reward. You were seeking that reward with Allah, and that burden that would have led to your punishment to be uplifted from you, right? So sahih, the validity, is when that ruling or the effect of these two things becomes realized, it becomes there. So he says, مَا تَرَتَّبَتْ آثَارُ فِعْلِهِ عَلَيْهِ. Right, the effects of what we sought that action for, or what we sought that ruling for, become realized, they become actualized, and they are there. He says here that they come in two forms, عِبَادَةً كَانَ أَمْ عَقْدًا. Whether it's an act of worship, meaning between you and Allah, or عَقْدًا, meaning it's a contract and a transaction between you and the creation. Before we move on, this is just a generic point, but why bring that differentiation to begin with? The difference between the two is this. So understand the difference between ibadah and aqd in this perspective, and there are a number of differentiating factors here. The most important one is this. If you were commanded to do an act of worship, you are burdened with doing it up until you do it correctly. If you got yourself into a contract or a transaction between you and an individual, and that transaction does not go as planned out, meaning it's an invalid transaction, you can simply just take back your properties and move away. There's no burden that continues with you. And because of that, the scholars of Islam vary between these two types of sihha and fasad. These two types of validity and invalidity. Why? Because the invalidity of acts of worship obligates another form of repetition, which is the qada and the i'adah and so on. Whereas, if you do not fulfill what is required of you in a contract and a transaction between you and a mere creation, you can just pull out and go your separate ways. You're not burdened with the continuity and going on with that specific sihha or fasad. Now he starts to explain the difference between each two. So he's going to start with ibadah, okay? فَالصَّحِيحُ مِنَ الْعِبَادَاتِ. That which is valid from acts of worship are. He defines it and he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, مَا بَرِئَتْ بِهِ الذِّمَّةِ وَسَقَطَ بِهِ الطَّلَبِ. Two clauses. The first is مَا بَرِئَتْ بِهِ الذِّمَّةِ. الذِّمَّةُ is the burden that you have on your shoulder. the obligation, right? It becomes uplifted. You are discharged of that legal demand. Allah Ta'ala commanding you that thing, you've done it now. And that's it. You don't have to redo it. But we'll come to you don't have to redo it again. But the obligation, that burden that you had on you, which is the dhimma here, the burden, right? Which is what the taklif is. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Taklif is something that is heavy, that the individual is burdened with. من الكلف, which is al-mashaqqa. So you have been burdened with a set of commandments that remain on your shoulder, that you're burdened with up until you do them correctly. The time of Maghrib enters, right? You are commanded to pray. You are burdened with that prayer. Up until you pray it, and you pray it validly, and if you were to pray it validly, bari'at bihi dhimma. Right? That burden is discharged. Right? The obligation is discharged. What happens as a result of that? This is the second clause, yeah? وَسَقَطَ بِهِ الطَّلَبِ. The talab was that you are supposed to do it. It's the command for you to carry out doing something. Now that command for you to do it has been removed. It fell. Meaning that you no longer need to repeat doing it again. So these are the two aspects of that govern as-sihhatu min al-ibadat. The author then explains and he says these two axes that govern validity in worship, which is the burden being uplifted and the lack of repetition. You no longer need to redo it. These are the two axes that as-sihha in ibadat relate to, right? These two cannot be found in uqood, in contracts and transactions, but only one can. Let me just finish this point and then we'll move on to questions, inshallah. So he says, وَالصَّحِيحُ مِنَ الْعُقُودِ مَا تَرَتَّبَتْ آثَارُهُ عَلَى وُجُودِهِ. That what is valid from transactions and contracts is that which what was intended by its doing and its legal rulings, the consequences of it are found and met. And he gives us a very good example to clarify to us what he means. And so he says, كَتَرَتُّ بِالْمِلْكِ عَلَى عَقْدِ الْبَيْعِ مَثَلًا. كَتَرَتُّ بِالْمِلْكِ عَلَى عَقْدِ الْبَيْعِ مَثَلًا. Such as ownership. Right? When you went and bought this drink, this car, this laptop, this phone, what is it that you wanted? You wanted to own that thing, meaning and the exclusive right to benefit from that. Right? And then you can give that right to others. That was the reason why you bought it. You paid money for it, for the exclusive right to own that thing, which is ownership, right? That is why you're paying money in exchange for that. When you buy a bottle of water, it's your water. You can do whatever you want with it. So he's trying to say, when that transaction is valid, ownership is there, which is the reason why we were doing it. When it's invalid, ownership is not there. You don't actually own this. It belongs to the person that was selling it to you, but the conditions of buying and selling were not met. And so it still belongs to him up until the correct conditions, right? The sabab, the mawani', the preventative measures of buying and selling, right? Until all of those are right and correct and valid, it still belongs to him. And then if I want it, I simply come back again and I buy it in an Islamically legal way. What does not happen in transactions is what? Say this, me buying this bottle of water is invalid. I bought it in a way that was wrong. And it still belongs to that individual. After my attempt to buy it didn't work out, I can simply walk away. But an act of worship, if you attempted to pray Salat al-Asr today, but you prayed without wudu, right? The condition was not met. You prayed. You said, Akhi, I tried. Allah Azza wa Jal won't hold me for that. You say to no. Your prayer was invalid. مَا سَقَطَ بِهِ الطَّلَبِ. that the requirement for you to pray has still not left you. You need to go back and pray. Whereas with contracts, that concept doesn't exist. I simply keep my money, he keeps his items and property, and we each walk our own way. And so there's no need, there's nothing that enforces upon us to repeat an attempt to buy again. Does that make sense? So that is the reason why I said earlier, the scholars of usul separate between validity and invalidity when it comes to ibadat, to uqood. But Zayn had a question first. Tfadal Zayn.
So what if someone says, I've completed the obligation, can I do it again?
So tikrar al-talab, you can't repeat the very same asr that you prayed. So right now, if you prayed asr in a valid manner, I can't start up again and pray that very same asr. No. Allah Azza wa Jal only commanded you with it that one time. And for you to introduce 5 asr prayers back to back, that's what? An innovation. Ma ata bihi ar-Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So you're not allowed to repeat it. But that's why you have the issue of nawafil, and that which you could do as, you know, an additional act of worship to Allah tabarak ta'ala. As for the very same obligation, then no, you can't repeat it. If it's valid and you have no reason to doubt it, then you cannot repeat it. Now,
The ibadat, is it only the wajib or is it all the 5? So when it comes to mubah, if I say yes, I'll do it. For example, sunnah.
I actually want to leave this issue alone, but from this mas'ala you get into a very important issue, which is, say somebody decided to pray a sunnah prayer. Is he simply allowed to cut it and walk away from it? Or does it become obligatory upon him to complete as a result of starting that sunnah prayer?
Because it's not wajib in the asr. The asr is that it wasn't
Obligatory.
that's what I
So that continues with him as well. Right? So here you have 2 stances amongst the scholars of Islam. The view amongst the scholars of Islam here, they're saying, look, by the asr remains, the ibadah, you just follow its initial ruling. Since it wasn't wajib to begin with, to continue on with it doesn't become wajib. To make it up after you left it off is not wajib either. Right? None of that becomes wajib. Why? Because it wasn't wajib initially. And then you have the other school, which is the principle of the Maliki and the Hanafis, which is أن المندوب يكون واجبا بالشروع. Right? Allah Tabarak Ta'ala says, يا الذين آمنوا لا تبطلوا أعمالكم. Right? Oh, you who believe, do not negate, falsify, break, make batil your acts of worship to me. So they say that because you've entered into that obligation, or you've entered into that recommended act, you have to continue with it. As a result of that, this issue continues on with them. Meaning that if you were to pray, but suddenly you had to say, for example, the sunnah prayer, you had to break it for whatever reason. Something happened, you decided to leave the sunnah prayer. They'd say you have to make it up after that too. So for them, the ibadat in this concept, it's not specific to wajib. Whereas the Shafi'is and the Hanabila, it is specific. For sahih min al-ibadat here, that's a very good point. He means specifically al-wajib. So according to the Shafi'is and the Hanabila, it is that which is obligatory and not that which is recommended. Is that clear? He concludes here with one last final point, which is how we know validity, okay? How do we know the validity of the aforementioned? And so he says, وَلَا يَكُونُ الشَّيْءُ صَحِيحًا إِلَّا بِتَمَامِ شُرُوطِهِ وَانْتِفَاءِ مَوَانِعِهِ. He says that nothing becomes valid. And so it's almost like saying validity requires. And he breaks them down and takes it back to 2 things, even though they can be taken back to 3. But 2 is also valid because sabab is a form of a shart, or can sometimes be a form of a shart. Okay? Meaning the cause can sometimes take the form of a condition. He says it requires 2 things for something to be valid. Number 1, the fulfillment of the conditions. بِتَمَامِ شُرُوطِهِ. That the conditions are all tamam. That they're all there and complete. All of the conditions of salah, that they are there and complete. That's number 1. Number 2, he says, وَانْتِفَاءِ مَوَانِعِ. Anything that would have prevented that thing, right, by being accepted by Allah Tabarak Ta'ala, that is also removed from this specific scenario as well. وَانْتِفَاءِ مَوَانِعِ. And so if the 2 are met, you say valid. If 1 is met, you say invalid. If neither are met, you say invalid. Okay? So validity is when all of the conditions are there and no preventative measures are there. Okay? So here he's going to give examples of itmam al-shurut in ibadah, and then itmam al-shurut in uqud, and then intifa' al-mawani' in ibadat, and then intifa' al-mawani' in uqud. So 4 scenarios he goes into now. The first scenario, he says, مثال ذلك في العبادات. The example of that in the acts of worship to Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is that the individual أن يأتي بالصلاة في وقتها. That an individual prays a prayer in its dedicated and specific time frame. The time of Dhuhr, the time of Asr, the time of Maghrib, that you pray the relevant prayer there. تامة شروطها وأركانها وواجباتها. Whilst all of the conditions of that prayer and its pillars and its obligations are all there. There you say, Salatun Sahiha. That's a valid prayer. Okay? He continues and he says, وَمِثَالُ ذَلِكَ فِي الْعُقُودِ. And the example of that in contracts and sale is أن يعقد بيعا. That the individual, he carries out a sale. He buys or he sells something, okay? And that sale for both parties and both sides was تامة شروطه. All of the conditions of buying and selling in Islam were there. Al-ma'rufa, that are known and well known. So the nuances don't really affect it. The nuances, we'll look at it here. So the Sheikh rahmatullah adds on al-ma'rufa because these sort of scenarios, sometimes yes, ignorance can be an excuse. Sometimes an individual maybe engages in buying or selling something that he doesn't necessarily know its rulings of. It doesn't mean that the sale there wasn't correct. So he says al-ma'rufa, but that has a separate conversation. We'll leave it off for now. Number 2, he says, مع انتفاء موانعه, along with the removal of all of the barriers and preventative issues and matters. He concludes and he says, فَإِن فُقِدَ شَرْطٌ مِنَ الشُّرُوطِ. This is more specific now. If a single condition is missing. So before we're talking about holistically, conditions have been met. But now we're talking about the conditions of salah. How many are the conditions of salah? However many. You think of it for now. Okay? The conditions of salah. If a single one goes amiss, that's it. This act of worship cannot be valid. He says the opposite is true as well. أَوْ وُجِدَ مَانِعٌ مِنَ الْمَوَانِعِ. Or a single preventative issue or matter. Say salah, how many preventative measures are there? A number and a range. A single one of them is sufficient in rendering that prayer null and void. Okay? امتنعت الصحة. That the validity becomes completely negated. You say there is no validity there, and with this specific thing. He starts to give those 4 scenarios now that I mentioned. Number 1, مثال فقد الشرط. Number 1, the example of the absence of a condition. The absence of a condition in acts of worship. أن يصلي بلا طهارة. That the individual prays without purification. He prays without wudu. You say what? Salah غير صحيحة. We're going to talk about what that salah is called. That salah is not valid. أن يصلي بلا طهارة. But why is it invalid? What would you say? So you'd say لفقد شرط, due to an absence of a condition. And you state that condition. You say your prayer is not valid. Why? It's missing this condition. It's missing this condition. The Prophet ﷺ says, La salata bighayri tahur. There's no prayer without purification. There's no prayer without purification. Number 2, وَمِثَالُ فَقْدِ الشَّرْطِ فِي الْعَقْدِ. The example of the absence of a condition in contracts and transactions and buying and selling. He says, أَنْ يَبِيعَ مَا لَا يَمْلِكُ. That the individual sells that which he does not own. The hadith of Hakim ibn Hizam. The Prophet ﷺ mentions the essential principles of the conditions of buying and selling in Islam. Innit? So the Prophet ﷺ said amongst them, the first one was, لا تبع ما ليس عندك. Don't sell something that you currently have. Right? You take money from somebody because you don't have it at this moment in time. And number 2, ولا تبع ما لا تملك. Do not sell something you don't own. Imagine if I took your phone and I come to the brother and I say to him, do you want to buy it from me? And he buys it from me. The essence and the default is that that transaction is not valid. Now you understand why he said al-ma'rufa, well known. Because that scenario can have 2 scenarios, right? It's either the person who's buying it knew that he was buying something that was stolen in essence. Like those people that run around the street selling things that they just stole from somebody. A phone, a laptop, a TV. Where there you can have dhannul ghalib. You can think and say, you know what? This guy's probably selling something to me that he does not own. He's just stolen it and he's just running around the street saying, who wants to buy an iPhone? You're not supposed to buy that. But it could be another scenario where somebody legitimately thinks that this thing, I have acquired it through a legitimate means and I now have ownership of it. And then as a result of that, I'm selling it on. Now as a result of that, the third party that buys in this sort of scenario is excused. Why? Because he couldn't have any knowledge regarding that. He was deceived by the individual who was selling. And so that takes us back to the issue of why the Sheikh rahimahullah says, al-ma'rufa, which is known. And so he gives an example of faqd shart, the absence of a condition in al-uqud, in transactions and contract, which is that the individual sells that which he does not own. Then we go through the opposite side. What was the opposite side, Zayn? So we said the absence of conditions, but what else do we need to look after when it comes to checking for the validity of things? Ahsan, the presence of preventative issues and matters. So he says, وَمِثَالُ وُجُودِ الْمَانِعِ فِي الْعِبَادَاتِ. The example of the individual praying, or the example of the presence of a preventative matter in acts of worship is, the example he's given us is, أن يتطوع بنفل مطلق في وقت نهي. That the individual prays a generic prayer that is recommended, voluntary, in a time that is prohibited. There's a lot of conditions in this statement here. Even though the Sheikh rahimahullah is Hanbali in essence, right? But we can split the types of prayers when it comes to awqat al-nahi into 3 categories. Into 3 categories, okay? The first type of prayer is, and look at it from the way he characterized it. As-salat al-wajiba. A prayer that's obligatory upon you. Say you missed a prayer. You woke up to Fajr late. And the time of waqt nahi entered. The time where it's prohibited for you to pray, the time frame that's prohibited for you to pray has entered. But you haven't prayed Fajr yet. What do? You have to pray Fajr. There's no issues there, okay? So obligatory prayers, exempt from this scenario. Number 2, التطوع بنفل مقيد. That you pray a sunnah prayer, but that is restricted and has a specific cause. The time of the waqt nahi of Salat al-Fajr entered. Or say right now, right, Salat al-Asr. We've entered into the masjid. This is waqt nahi. The Prophet ﷺ prohibited us from praying. Right? Waqt nahi are 3 times, and they can be extended to 5. وفي ثلاثة من الأوقات ينهى عن النفل من الصلاة أولها بعد صلاة الصبح إلى ارتفاع الشمس قيد رمح وحين الاستواء إلى الزوال لا في جمعة فجائز لا جدل ثالثها بعد صلاة العصر إلى الغروب ثم من ذا الحضر فاستثن عند البيت لا تمتنع صلاتنا في أي وقت تقع كذا لمدرك الإمام بعد أن صلى برحله إعادة تسن وهذه بالنص أما الشافعي فكل ذات سبب لم يمنع. And so, with regards to that framework, you've got those 3 times, Fajr, up until the sun starts to come up, Qida Rumh, Zawal, up until when the sun is, what's called the zenith. Right? The sun is right on top of us, up until it shifts slightly, and after Salat al-Asr, or the time of Salat al-Asr enters, the only thing you're supposed to pray is the Asr prayer and the Sunnah before it, before having come, and then after that, there's nothing all the way till Ghurub al-Shams. These 3 times are considered awqatun nahi. And they have a discussion in the books of fiqh, we won't go into that today. So, wajib we understood in that time frame. The second type of tatawwu is the tatawwu that has a reason. The nafila, the sunnah that has a reason. Such as if you were to enter the masjid right now to pray tahiyyat al-masjid. Is that allowed or not allowed? Yajuz. Now it's based upon the opinion of some of the companions of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and from amongst the 4 schools of thought, it's more specifically the view of the Shafi'iyya. Okay? And they refer to it as Dhawat al-Asbab. Dhawat al-Asbab. Meaning the prayers that have a specific reason as to why we pray them. A cause. Okay? A good example of that is Tahiyyat al-Masjid. Another good example of that is what? Rak'atay al-Tawaf. Individual does Tawaf, he's supposed to pay 2 rak'ahs after that, like the Messenger of Sallallahu used to do, right? Say that 2 rak'at end up in a time that is waqt nahi. What are you supposed to do? Do you stop your umrah? Do you wait? No, you just pray. Like the Prophet ﷺ did, right? To the rest of the reasons that are considered to be, or the sunnahs that are considered to be due to a specific reason. They're called Dhawat al-Asbab. In this context, they refer to them as At-Tatawwu' bi-Naflin Muqayyadin. The author says, I'm not speaking about those 2. I'm talking about a 3rd category, which is what he's talking about here, which is At-Tatawwu' bi-Naflin Mutlaqin. When you stand up to pray a recommended and a sunnah prayer that has no reason whatsoever. Say what, we've all entered the masjid right now, right? Maybe we've all prayed Tahiyyat al-Masjid. But before the time of Maghrib comes in, say if we just stood up and we decided to pray as many sunnahs as we can. What is the ruling of that? It's not permissible, right? It's muharram. It's prohibited. Due to the fact that the Prophet ﷺ prohibited us from a salah fi waqti nahi. Told us not to pray in times we're prohibited to pray. Does that make sense? So the fact that you're praying a prayer like this in a time frame like this, then that time frame is considered to be a preventative matter or issue to that type of prayer. Remember the 3 types that I mentioned to you. We're talking about wajib, we're not talking about al-tatawwu' al-mutlaq, al-muqayyad. We're talking about a specific type of recommended and sunnah prayers. Okay? So, because of that mani', that preventative matter, which is the time frame, we say that whoever stood up and prayed 10, 20, 30 rak'at in that time frame, for no reason, all those prayers are what? Batil, invalid, right? Yunafi as-sihha. It opposes that validity. Why? If somebody asked you and said, why is it invalid? I was praying to Allah. The conditions of prayers were met. What is the reason why it's invalid? Wujud al-mani'. The presence of a preventative issue. And that preventative issue with this type of prayer is what? Is the fact that it occurred in a time frame that we are prohibited of praying this type of prayer in. Does that make sense? He then moves us on to the next example, which is وَمِثَالُ وُجُودِ الْمَانِعِ فِي الْعَقْدِ. The fourth and the last of these examples that he wanted to give, which is the example in the parable of the presence of a mani', this time in contracts and transactions. And he gives an example and he says, أَنْ يَبِيعَ مَنْ تَلْزَمُهُ الْجُمُعَةِ شَيْئًا بَعْدَ نِدَائِهَا الثَّانِي عَلَى وَجْهٍ لَا يُبَاحٍ. And this is a very specific scenario as well. An individual, the obligation upon him was to pray Salat al-Jumu'ah, because he's a man that reaches the age of puberty, right? He is above that age where prayers become obligatory upon him. And he's resident in the cities to the rest of the conditions that obligate upon him Salat al-Jumu'ah. So here he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, man talzamuhu al-Jumu'ah. Right there, and add on, Ahlul Wujub. Ahlul Wujub. Meaning the individuals that Salat al-Jumu'ah becomes wajib upon. And it becomes prohibited, Ahlul Wujub. The individuals that prayer becomes wajib. So for example, the musafir and the woman and so on, the traveler and the woman, they may choose to join us in Jumu'ah. But Jumu'ah is not wajib upon them. Right? So these are considered مَنْ لَا تَلْزَمْهُمُ الْجُمُعَةِ. Those individuals that Jumu'ah is not necessary upon them to, they engage, is not required for them to attend. But this individual that we're talking about right now is an individual who is required for him to be praying at this time. Right? Now the second condition that he mentions is, number 2, بَعْدَ نِدَائِهَا الثَّانِي. بَعْدَ نِدَائِهَا الثَّانِي. That after the second nida, the second adhan. And that second adhan didn't exist in the early parts of Islam. It was something that was added on by who? Uthman ibn Affan. Ahsant. Fatah Allahu alayk. Uthman ibn Affan. Right? Al-Khalifa al-Rashida. Before his time, during the Khilafah during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Khilafah of Abubakar, Khilafah of Umar, and a portion of the Khilafah of Uthman, there was no such thing as 2 nidas for Jumu'ah. But when you notice the fact that the Muslims became so many people were praying Salat al-Jumu'ah, he created one to kind of tell them to get ready, and a second adhan for now the time of Jumu'ah, the time of Dhuhr has actually entered. So the Ahkam, the rulings associated with Jumu'ah apply when? After the first, after the second? The second. The first one is just simply a wake-up call, a reminder. A bit like the first adhan of Fajr. So he says the second condition is بَعْدَ نِدَائِهَا الثَّانِي. After the second adhan, when the obligation of Salat al-Jumu'ah comes about. Before that, there is no obligation. The first adhan was simply what? A wake-up call. Now, that second adhan that the Ahkam become obligatory, or we associate the rulings of Islam with, mean that you as a Muslim have to be heading to the masjid. And to the rest of the rulings, there is another ruling that he says becomes associated with you, which is what? That you do not sell in that time frame. Who does not sell? The individual that is required to be in the masjid praying Salat al-Jumu'ah, number 1. Number 2, in that specific time frame. You're not supposed to be selling. That individual decides to walk into a shop whilst the khatib is already standing on the minbar, and he decides to buy something. What is the ruling of that transaction? So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, and now he adds on one last condition, okay? Ala wajhin la yubah. In a manner that is not permissible. And he means by this, rahimahullah ta'ala, and this is something that you find a lot in, say, Muslim countries. Say an individual, he decides to, say you're going to Masjid al-Nabawi. Very good example. It happens to be all the time. It happens to be a lot, especially in the heat of the summer. Say you're walking towards the Haram, and you still see a shop open, and the second adhan has gone off. But you know you're not going to make it to the insides of the haram. The doors are closed by this time. You're going to pray outside. So you're looking for a sajada to pray upon. But you also can't buy it this time as well. So what would you do? You simply take one. You tell the person, look, I'm going to take one. After the salah, I'm going to pay you, for example. Right? And you just come by after the prayer to avoid this ruling. These are makharij. But the point the Sheikh rahimahullah is trying to say is, in a manner that is impermissible. So where the transaction is complete. You bought, you sold. You took your property, you paid in that amount. I'm just going to finish the last example, Last example, I'm finished. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, that individual, that bay' is considered invalid. Right? Bay'un ghayru sahih. Bay' that is fasid. With those conditions. So if an individual was to buy and sell in that manner, that transaction would be invalid. They would have to repeat that, and the outcomes that we were looking for in transactions, which is that milkiyah, the ownership, would not come about in a transaction in that specific time frame. The Sheikh rahimahullah is simply trying to teach us that that transaction is invalid due to a reason. What is the reason? لِوُجُودِ الْمَانِعِ. What is the mani' here? أحسنت النداء الثاني. The preventative issue or matter that prevents the validity of that transaction and that contract in Islam is the time frame it occurred in, which is the second adhan, and everything else specifies it to the individual it concerns and so on. But that time frame, Allah Tabarak Ta'ala made it a time frame that buying and selling are not allowed for the individual that is required to be in the masjid for worship. And with that, we've done all four of those examples. An example of the absence of conditions. An example of absence of conditions in worship. Absence of conditions in transactions. Presence of preventative issues and matters in worship. And the presence of preventative issues and matters in transactions. So we'll stop here, inshallah ta'ala. We'll take al-fasid in next week's session. هذا والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن